The Woman in Room 7 Never Checked Out. A Miss Marple Mystery. Chapter 1. The Empty Key Hook. The rain had stopped just before noon, leaving the windows of the White Heather Hotel bright with droplets that sparkled in the pale spring sunlight. The hotel stood on the edge of Brambleford, a market town nestled among rolling fields and hedgerows in the year 1958. It was not grand enough to attract aristocrats, nor shabby enough to discourage respectable travellers. Commercial representatives stayed there when passing through the county. Elderly ladies took rooms during visits to relatives. Occasionally an artist or writer sought quiet among the countryside lanes. Its proprietor, Mrs. Edith Barlow, considered the White Heather a place where nothing remarkable ever happened. That belief lasted until the morning Room 7 remained locked. At 11:30, Edith stood behind the reception desk reviewing invoices while her chambermaid, Elsie Turner, carried a basket of fresh linens upstairs. A few moments later, Elsie returned. There was an unusual expression on her face. "Mrs. Barlow?" "Yes." "There's something odd about Room 7. Edith glanced up. "What sort of odd?" "The lady hasn't answered. Perhaps she's gone out." Elsie shifted uneasily. The keys still hanging behind the desk. That attracted Edith's attention immediately. Guests who left the hotel normally collected their room keys. It was a habit so routine nobody thought about it. "The keys here?" "Yes." Edith looked toward the brass rack mounted beside the reception counter. There, dangling neatly from its hook, was the tag marked 7. She frowned. "Maybe she's asleep. I knocked 3 times. Did you hear anything?" "No." Edith rose from her chair. The woman occupying Room 7 had arrived 4 days earlier. She had signed the register as Mrs. Helena March, a widow, according to her paperwork. Quiet, polite, approximately 50 years old. She had spent most of her time reading in the lounge and taking evening walks through the town. Nobody had considered her memorable. Yet suddenly Edith realized she could not clearly picture her face. Only fragments remained. Dark coat, grey hat, soft voice, nothing more. "Come along," Edith said. Together they climbed the staircase. The corridor on the second floor stretched beneath floral wallpaper that had begun to fade after years of sunlight. Room 7 stood near the end. Its door remained firmly shut. Edith knocked. "Mrs. March?" Silence. She knocked again. "Mrs. March, it's Mrs. Barlow." Nothing. The proprietor exchanged a glance with Elsie. Then she unlocked the door. The room beyond appeared perfectly tidy. The bed was made. The curtains were open. A teacup sat upon a side table. A book rested beside an armchair. Nothing appeared disturbed. Nothing appeared alarming. And yet, nobody was there. "Well," said Edith, "perhaps she's gone out after all." Elsie looked around. Without her handbag, Edith followed her gaze. A black leather handbag sat upon the dressing table. A pair of gloves lay beside it. There was also a compact mirror and a small bottle of perfume. Items a woman rarely abandoned voluntarily. The silence inside the room suddenly felt different. Edith stepped farther in. "Mrs. March?" No answer. She opened the wardrobe. Inside hung 2 dresses and a raincoat. A suitcase rested below. Still packed, still present, still untouched. Elsie swallowed. "That's strange. Very strange." The proprietor crossed toward the window. The view overlooked a narrow garden enclosed by stone walls. There was no sign of anyone outside. No footprints, no movement, nothing. Yet the guest was gone. A curious uneasiness settled over Edith's shoulders. Not fear, not yet, only confusion. She returned downstairs and consulted the register. "Mrs. Helena March. Checked in Tuesday afternoon. Address listed as London. No local relatives. No visitors. No forwarding destination. Nothing useful." By 1 o'clock, concern had replaced confusion. By 3 o'clock, concern had become worry. By 5 o'clock, Edith telephoned the police. Inspector Leonard Pike disliked mysteries before supper. He was a practical man whose preferred investigations involved stolen bicycles, drunk farmers, and missing livestock. Missing hotel guests were another matter entirely, especially when they seemed to have vanished into thin air. He arrived shortly after 6. His sergeant accompanied him. After examining room 7, Pike reached an immediate conclusion. "She's gone somewhere." Edith blinked. "Gone where?" The inspector shrugged. "People leave. Without their luggage? Occasionally. Without their handbag? Perhaps. Without collecting money from the bank?" The inspector looked up. "What bank?" Edith explained. Mrs. March had withdrawn cash 2 days earlier. The money remained inside an envelope within the bedside drawer. Pike inspected it. Several banknotes remained untouched. He frowned. That detail did not fit comfortably. People disappeared. People ran away. People changed plans. But they generally took their money. Any family? Not that she mentioned. Friends? No. The inspector studied the room once more. Everything remained orderly. Nothing suggested violence. Nothing suggested struggle. No broken objects. No blood. No signs of forced entry. Only absence. Pure absence. And absence was difficult to investigate. By the following morning, the story had spread across Brambleford. The bakery discussed it. The post office discussed it. The church ladies discussed it. The butcher discussed it with anyone unfortunate enough to enter his shop. Theories multiplied rapidly. A secret lover, an espionage affair, a nervous breakdown, an unpaid debt, a hidden husband. Every citizen seemed confident they understood the truth. Every citizen contradicted everyone else. At the Vicarage Lane tea rooms, several elderly ladies debated the matter over sponge cake. Among them sat Miss Jane Marple. She listened quietly, as she often did. Miss Marple had come to Brambleford for a short visit with an old school friend recovering from influenza. The disappearance interested her immediately, not because it appeared sensational, because it appeared peculiar. And peculiar things frequently had ordinary explanations disguised beneath unusual appearances. "The woman probably ran away," declared Mrs. Finch. "Nonsense," replied Mrs. Cooper. "Why leave her handbag? To confuse people. Why leave money? To confuse them further." Miss Marple stirred her tea. "I wonder." The others looked toward her. Mrs. Finch smiled. "What do you think, Miss Marple?" Miss Marple considered. "I think people rarely behave contrary to their own habits without a reason." Mrs. Cooper laughed. "That sounds very wise." "It usually isn't," said Miss Marple pleasantly. "One simply notices patterns." She looked out the window. Across the street, townspeople continued discussing the vanished guest. The excitement pleased them. Most villages enjoyed a mystery. What none of them realized was that the mystery had only begun. Because later that afternoon, while Inspector Pike was preparing a routine report, a discovery would transform a curious disappearance into something far darker. A discovery hidden in plain sight. A discovery connected to Room 7. And when it emerged, Brambleford would learn that Mrs. Helena March had not merely gone missing. Someone had been very careful to make certain she could not return. Chapter 2. The Name Written Twice. Inspector Leonard Pike had almost finished his report when the telephone rang. He stared at it for a moment with mild irritation. The clock on his office wall showed 20 minutes past 4. The day had already become more troublesome than he preferred. The disappearance of Mrs. Helena March was unusual enough, but not yet a crime. At least, not officially. He lifted the receiver. "Pike speaking." A hesitant male voice answered. "Inspector? It's Harold Briggs from the railway station." Pike sat up slightly. "Yes? I thought perhaps you'd want to see something." "What sort of something?" There was a pause. "A suitcase." The station at Brambleford consisted of 2 platforms, a ticket office, and a waiting room that smelled permanently of coal dust and damp newspapers. When Pike arrived, Harold Briggs was waiting beside the lost property office. The station master was a nervous man whose spectacles always seemed on the verge of falling from his nose. He greeted the inspector with visible relief. "It's this way." He led Pike into a small storage room. Several umbrellas and forgotten parcels occupied a shelf. On the floor sat a brown leather suitcase. Nothing remarkable about it, at first glance. "Who does it belong to?" asked Pike. Harold cleared his throat. "That's the curious part." He handed over a luggage tag. Pike examined it. The name, written neatly in black ink, was Helena March. The inspector felt a slight tightening in his stomach. Where was this found? Platform 2. When? Yesterday morning. Pike looked up sharply. Yesterday? Yes. Why wasn't I informed? Harold looked embarrassed. Because until this morning I didn't connect it with the missing woman. The inspector crouched beside the suitcase. The lock was not secured. He opened it carefully. Inside were women's clothes, toiletries, a hairbrush, several folded letters. Everything appeared ordinary until he reached the bottom. There he found a photograph of the woman from room 7, Mrs. Helena March. There could be little doubt. The same dark hair, the same calm eyes, the same reserved expression. Yet something immediately troubled him. On the back of the photograph someone had written, Helena March, Blackwater House, 1939. Pike frowned. The handwriting looked recent. Not 17 years old, recent, as though the photograph had been labelled only recently. The inspector disliked details that felt wrong. He disliked them even more when he could not explain why. An hour later he sat inside the White Heather Hotel lounge. The suitcase rested beside his chair. Mrs. Edith Barlow peered anxiously at the photograph. "Yes, that's her." "You're certain?" "Quite certain." Inspector Pike nodded. Then he produced one of the letters found in the suitcase. The envelope bore the same name, Helena March, the same London address listed in the hotel register. Everything appeared straightforward, yet something continued nagging at him, a small inconsistency, a whisper in the back of his mind. Unfortunately, he could not identify it, and so he did what experienced policemen often do when uncertain. He set the problem aside temporarily. Sometimes answers arrived on their own. The following morning, Miss Marple received a visitor. The visitor was her old friend, Mrs. Beatrice Fenwick, with whom she was staying. Beatrice entered carrying a newspaper. "They found a suitcase." Miss Marple accepted the paper. "I heard. The whole town is talking about it." "That does seem likely." Beatrice settled into an armchair. "You don't sound surprised." "My dear Beatrice, villages have discussed missing hens with less enthusiasm than they're discussing this disappearance." That earned a laugh. Miss Marple read the article carefully. Her eyes lingered on a particular sentence. A very small sentence, one almost everyone else would skip. The article stated that the suitcase contained correspondence addressed to Helena March. Miss Marple folded the newspaper. "Interesting." "What is?" "The letters." Beatrice blinked. "The letters?" "Yes." "What about them?" Miss Marple smiled faintly. "Nothing yet." Which was true, at least partly. She merely had the uncomfortable feeling that something was out of place. Not enough to form a conclusion, only enough to make her curious. And curiosity, in Miss Marple's experience, often proved useful. That afternoon she visited the White Heather. The lounge was quiet. Only 2 guests occupied armchairs near the fireplace. Mrs. Barlow welcomed her warmly. They exchanged pleasantries before the conversation inevitably drifted toward the missing woman. "Such a dreadful business," said Edith. "Indeed. You met her once, I believe." Miss Marple nodded. "Only briefly." "Did she strike you as unusual?" Miss Marple considered. "Not unusual. Then what?" "Careful." The hotel proprietor frowned. "Careful?" "Very careful." Mrs. Barlow appeared puzzled. Miss Marple continued gently. "Some people speak without thinking. Others think before speaking." "And Mrs. March?" She selected her words. The observation surprised Edith. She had spoken to the woman several times, but had never considered the matter. Now that Miss Marple mentioned it, however, she remembered. Mrs. March had answered questions politely, yet rarely volunteered information. A cautious woman, a private woman, perhaps even a secretive one. While they spoke, another guest entered the lounge. A tall man in his early 40s, well-dressed, dark-haired, handsome in a restrained sort of way. Mrs. Barlow lowered her voice. "That's Mr. Victor Hale." Miss Marple glanced toward him. "A guest." "Only for 3 nights." The man crossed the room carrying a newspaper. As he passed, his gaze briefly settled on the reception desk. Only for a second, yet Miss Marple noticed something curious, a flicker of recognition, almost immediately hidden. She watched him continue toward a chair by the window. There was nothing dramatic about the moment, nothing anyone else would have noticed. But Miss Marple had spent decades observing people, and people rarely looked at places without reason, particularly when they believed nobody was watching. Later that day, Inspector Pike paid another visit to the hotel. His mood was considerably worse. The suitcase had created more questions than answers. The biggest question concerned timing. If Helena March vanished from room 7 on Thursday night, why had her suitcase appeared at the station on Thursday morning? The chronology made no sense, unless one assumption was wrong. And Pike hated assumptions. They were often responsible for mistakes. As he entered the reception area, he noticed Miss Marple seated nearby. He knew her reputation. Several policemen in neighboring counties knew it as well. Some admired her. Others regarded her as a troublesome old lady with inconvenient instincts. Pike occupied a position somewhere between the two. "Good afternoon, Miss Marple. Inspector, I understand you're interested in our mystery." "A little." The inspector smiled politely. "Any theories?" "Oh no." She folded her knitting. "Only questions." "Such as?" Miss Marple hesitated. Then she asked, "Has anyone confirmed that Helena March was actually Helena March?" The question stopped him cold. Inspector Pike stared at her. For a moment neither spoke. Then he replied carefully, "The hotel register identifies her." "Certainly." "The letters identify her." "Yes." "The suitcase identifies her." "Quite so." The inspector crossed his arms. "Then who else would she be?" Miss Marple smiled. "A very sensible question. And sensible questions deserve sensible answers." Pike waited. Miss Marple's expression remained pleasant. Unfortunately, no answer followed. The inspector sighed. "You think something's wrong with the name?" "I merely think names can be borrowed." That was all she said. Yet after she departed, Pike found himself staring at the hotel register. The signature looked ordinary enough. Helena March. Neat handwriting. Nothing suspicious. Still, Miss Marple had planted a seed, and once planted, such seeds had an unfortunate habit of growing. That evening, a development occurred that changed everything. A clerk from a London insurance office telephoned the police station. The conversation lasted less than 5 minutes. When it ended, Inspector Pike remained motionless. Then he reached for the photograph recovered from the suitcase. He studied it again, very carefully, because the clerk had just informed him of a remarkable fact, a fact impossible to ignore. According to official records, Helena March had died 3 years earlier. Not vanished, not disappeared, died. The death certificate existed. The funeral had taken place. The estate had been settled. And yet somehow a woman calling herself Helena March had recently checked into the White Heather Hotel. For the first time since the investigation began, Inspector Pike became convinced he was no longer dealing with a missing person case. Someone had assumed a dead woman's identity. The question was why? A second question followed immediately behind it. If the woman in room 7 was not Helena March, then who had vanished from the hotel? And who, somewhere in Brambleford, had reason to ensure she remained silent forever? Chapter 3. The Widow Who Wasn't a Widow. The news arrived in Brambleford before breakfast. By 9 o'clock it had reached the bakery. By 10 o'clock it had spread through the market square. By noon, Nearly everyone in town knew the astonishing fact. The woman who had occupied room 7 was not Helena March. At least, she could not be. The real Helena March had died 3 years earlier. Nobody seemed capable of discussing anything else. Miss Marple, meanwhile, sat quietly beside the drawing-room window at Mrs. Fenwick's house and listened as her friend recounted the latest rumours. There are dozens of theories already. I imagine so. One man says she was a spy, Miss Marple continued knitting. Spies appear in village gossip far more often than in real life. Another believes she was hiding from criminals. That is slightly more probable. And Mrs. Gresham claims she was secretly married to a duke. Miss Marple smiled. That is almost certainly impossible. Beatrice laughed. How do you know? My dear, if she had been married to a duke, someone would have mentioned it long before now. At the police station, Inspector Pike was considerably less amused. A dead woman's identity being used by a stranger transformed the entire investigation. The London authorities had confirmed the records. The genuine Helena March had lived in Croydon. She had died from pneumonia during the winter of 1955. Multiple witnesses had attended the funeral. The death certificate was legitimate. No mistake existed. The woman at the White Heather had deliberately adopted another person's identity, which raised troubling questions. Why choose a dead woman? Why travel to Brambleford? Why disappear? Most importantly, why leave behind enough evidence to prove she was Helena March while simultaneously making that claim impossible? The contradiction irritated Pike. Criminals often made mistakes, but this felt deliberate, as though someone wanted investigators to discover the false identity, or perhaps had failed to remove all traces of it. Neither possibility pleased him. The first breakthrough came from an unexpected source. A local photographer named Arthur Bell visited the police station carrying a small cardboard box. I thought perhaps you'd want these. Pike looked up. Want what? Pictures. The photographer placed the box on the desk. Last Saturday there was the Spring Market Festival. The inspector nodded. The annual festival had drawn visitors from neighbouring villages. Food stalls, flower displays, local competitions. Nothing remarkable, except that large crowds created opportunities. Arthur opened the box. I take photographs every year. He produced several prints. People browsing stalls. Children running through the square. Farmers talking near livestock pens. Then he paused. I found this one. The photograph showed a crowd gathered around a flower competition. Near the edge stood a woman in a dark coat, a woman matching the description of the missing guest. Pike leaned forward. You're certain that's her? Arthur nodded. I saw the newspaper picture. The inspector studied the image. For the first time, he saw the woman outdoors. She appeared alert, watchful, not relaxed like someone enjoying a festival. She seemed to be observing, waiting, looking beyond the crowd. Pike's eyes narrowed. What is she watching? Arthur pointed. A man stood partly visible at the far edge of the photograph. Only his profile appeared. Nothing distinctive, yet the missing woman's gaze was fixed directly upon him. The inspector carefully set the photograph aside. Do you know who he is? Arthur squinted. Can't say. That answer was disappointing. Still, the photograph represented the first genuine lead. The woman had not simply wandered into Brambleford by accident. She had been watching someone. That afternoon, Inspector Pike assembled a list of people known to have interacted with the missing guest. The list was surprisingly short. The false Helena March had been cautious. She spoke politely. She revealed little. She asked few questions. Yet 3 names appeared repeatedly. 3 individuals who had encountered her more than once. The first was Victor Hale, the well-dressed guest currently staying at the White Heather. Several witnesses remembered seeing him speak briefly with the woman 2 evenings before her disappearance. The second was Mrs. Ruth Pennington, a wealthy widow who owned Blackwater House, a large estate situated beyond the village. Interestingly, the photograph found in the suitcase bore the words Blackwater House, 1939. The connection immediately attracted attention. The third was Dr. Simon Farrow, a respected local physician. According to hotel staff, he had been observed conversing with the missing woman outside the post office. The discussion appeared serious. Neither participant seemed pleased. 3 people, 3 possible connections, no obvious explanation. Meanwhile, Miss Marple pursued a different line of inquiry. Experience had taught her that names often mattered less than habits. People could invent identities, they could forge documents, they could lie about their past. What proved more difficult was disguising routine behavior. Human habits tended to reveal character, and character, in Miss Marple's opinion, solved more crimes than fingerprints ever could. She returned to the White Heather and requested permission to inspect the lounge. Mrs. Barlow readily agreed. There isn't much to see. There rarely is. Miss Marple wandered through the room, an armchair near the fireplace, a writing desk beside the window, several bookshelves, nothing unusual. Then she noticed something. The writing desk contained a blotter. On the blotter remained faint impressions left by previous writing. Most people would ignore them. Miss Marple did not. She tilted the surface toward the light. Several incomplete words appeared, almost invisible. She could make out fragments. Tuesday, meeting. 7 o'clock. Then a surname, only partly visible, yet readable enough. Pennington. Miss Marple became very still. Interesting. Very interesting indeed. The following day she paid a call upon Mrs. Ruth Pennington. Blackwater House stood beyond the village among ancient beech trees. Built during the Victorian era, it possessed the imposing confidence of old money. Its owner received Miss Marple politely. Ruth Pennington was 62 years old, elegant, self-controlled, accustomed to authority. After exchanging pleasantries, Miss Marple casually mentioned the disappearance. Mrs. Pennington's expression changed almost imperceptibly, only a slight tightening around the eyes. Most people would have missed it. Miss Marple did not. A terrible business. Quite. I understand the missing woman may have had some connection with Blackwater House. The widow hesitated, for perhaps a second, then recovered. None that I know of. How curious. Why curious? Because a photograph found among her belongings was labelled Blackwater House. Mrs. Pennington's teacup paused midway to her lips. Again, only briefly, yet the reaction existed. Really? Yes. I cannot imagine why. The answer sounded reasonable, perhaps perfectly truthful. Yet Miss Marple left unconvinced. Not because of what Mrs. Pennington said, because of what she did not say. There had been recognition. Of that, Miss Marple felt certain. That evening, another unexpected event occurred. Someone entered room 7. The room was officially sealed pending investigation. No guests were permitted inside. Yet shortly after midnight, the night porter heard movement upstairs. He assumed a guest had become lost. By the time he investigated, the corridor was empty. The door to room 7 stood slightly open. Inside, nothing appeared disturbed, at least initially. The following morning, Inspector Pike conducted a thorough inspection. Only then did he notice a difference. The handbag remained on the dressing table. The gloves remained untouched. The perfume bottle remained exactly where it had been, but one item was missing. A small notebook. Mrs. Barlow distinctly remembered seeing it among the woman's belongings. Now it had vanished. Someone had risked entering a sealed room, not to steal money, not to remove luggage, only to retrieve a notebook, which meant the notebook contained something important, something dangerous, something worth exposing oneself to considerable risk. When Inspector Pike learned of the theft, he felt both frustration and excitement. At last, a genuine sign that someone involved in the case was nervous, and nervous people often made mistakes. Late that night, Miss Marple sat beside her bedroom fire. The events of the day moved quietly through her thoughts. The false identity, the photograph, Blackwater House, the missing notebook, Mrs. Pennington's reaction. The festival photograph. None of the pieces fit together yet, not properly, and yet she felt increasingly certain of one thing. The woman from room 7 had come to Brambleford with a purpose, a very specific purpose. She had not been hiding, she had been searching for someone, or something, and whatever she discovered had frightened another person enough to commit a dangerous act. Miss Marple placed her knitting aside. Outside, the village slept peacefully beneath the moonlight. Yet somewhere nearby, a man or woman was growing increasingly anxious, because the secret they believed buried long ago was beginning to surface. And secrets, Miss Marple reflected, had an unfortunate tendency to rise when least expected, especially those hidden for nearly 20 years. Chapter 4. The Secret of Blackwater House. The weather changed overnight. A steady wind swept across the countryside, bending the hawthorn hedges and rattling the old windows of Brambleford's cottages. Miss Marple always believed changing weather affected people more than they admitted. Storms unsettled tempers, heat encouraged carelessness, cold often brought caution, and on this particular morning she sensed caution spreading through the village. The disappearance was no longer merely an interesting mystery. The discovery of the false identity and the theft from room 7 had transformed it into something darker. People lowered their voices when discussing it. Doors were closed before conversations began. Several villagers who had eagerly shared opinions only days earlier suddenly claimed to know very little. That, Miss Marple thought, was often revealing. People who genuinely knew nothing rarely felt compelled to say so repeatedly. Inspector Pike spent the morning reviewing records connected to Blackwater House. The estate had belonged to the Pennington family for decades. Nothing unusual appeared at first. Taxes, property transfers, routine legal matters. Then he found references to an incident in 1939, a minor newspaper article, small enough to be overlooked. The headline read, "Local maid dismissed after theft allegation." Pike read carefully. According to the article, a young servant named Clara Morton had been accused of stealing jewellery from Blackwater House shortly before the outbreak of war. The jewellery was never recovered. Clara Morton had denied the accusation. Nevertheless, she was dismissed. The matter quickly disappeared from public attention. The inspector frowned. It seemed insignificant. Yet two details caught his attention. First, the date matched the inscription on the photograph. Second, the article included a photograph of Blackwater House staff. Among them stood a young woman, Clara Morton. Pike stared at the image, then reached for the photograph recovered from Helena March's suitcase. He compared the faces. Age changed people, years altered features, yet certain characteristics remained. The shape of the eyes, the line of the jaw, the curve of a smile. The resemblance was unmistakable. A possibility formed immediately. A startling possibility. What if the woman known as Helena March was actually Clara Morton? An hour later he visited Miss Marple. He found her in Mrs. Fenwick's garden, trimming roses. "I hope I'm not interrupting." Miss Marple smiled. "Not at all, Inspector." Pike handed her the newspaper clipping. She adjusted her spectacles and read silently. When she finished, she looked thoughtful rather than surprised. "You had already considered something similar, hadn't you?" Miss Marple laughed softly. "My dear Inspector, one reaches a certain age only by learning not to be surprised too often. You think the missing woman was Clara Morton. I think it is possible." Pike sat down. "Why would she return after 19 years? Miss Marple clipped another rose. "Because people rarely return to old places without unfinished business. Revenge, perhaps. Blackmail, perhaps. Justice." Miss Marple paused. "That too is possible." The inspector sighed. He had hoped for something more definite. Miss Marple rarely offered certainty until she possessed it. Unfortunately, she was usually correct when she finally did. That afternoon, he arranged an interview with Ruth Pennington. The widow received him in the library of Blackwater House. Tall windows overlooked the grounds, books lined the walls, a fire crackled gently despite the mild weather. The setting projected comfort and respectability. Inspector Pike noticed neither seemed to improve Mrs. Pennington's mood. "Inspector, Mrs. Pennington." He wasted little time. "Do you remember Clara Morton?" The widow's expression froze. "Only briefly, but long enough." "Yes. You employed her in 1939. "I did. She was dismissed for theft." "Correct. Was she guilty?" A flicker crossed her face. "Not certainty. Not confidence. Something else. Memory." "I believed she was." "Believed?" Mrs. Pennington folded her hands. "It was a very long time ago. Did the missing jewellery ever reappear?" "No." "Did Clara admit stealing it?" "No." The answer emerged more sharply than the others. The inspector noticed. So did Mrs. Pennington. A brief silence followed. Finally she said, "I fail to see what this has to do with current events." Pike studied her carefully. "That depends." "On what?" "Whether Clara Morton is the woman who vanished from room 7. For the first time, genuine alarm appeared in her eyes. Not dramatic, not theatrical, but real and impossible to miss. Meanwhile, another thread of the mystery began to unravel. Victor Hale, the handsome guest at the White Heather Hotel, had become increasingly uneasy. Several witnesses later recalled seeing him pacing near the gardens behind the hotel. Others reported he seemed distracted during meals. One waitress observed him staring repeatedly toward room 7's corridor. The behavior eventually reached Inspector Pike. That evening he requested a formal interview. Victor arrived at the station looking irritated. "I assume this won't take long." "That depends." The inspector placed the festival photograph on the desk. Victor's eyes widened almost imperceptibly. A reaction, small, but present. "You recognize this woman?" "I've seen her." "Where?" "At the hotel." "Did you know her?" "No." The answer came too quickly. Pike noticed. Victor noticed that Pike noticed. An uncomfortable silence followed. Finally, the inspector asked, "Then why did you speak with her?" Victor hesitated. "Only for a second." Yet that second mattered. "We exchanged pleasantries." "Several times?" "It was a hotel. People speak." The explanation sounded reasonable, yet somehow unsatisfactory. Pike leaned forward. "Mr. Hale, are you acquainted with Blackwater House?" Victor's face changed. "Not dramatically, just enough." "Yes." "How?" "My family lived nearby years ago." "Did you know Clara Morton?" Victor looked away, and that, more than anything else, captured Pike's attention. Because innocent people usually answered questions. Guilty people often examined the wallpaper first. "I knew of her." The inspector made a note. The interview continued for another 20 minutes. Nothing conclusive emerged. Yet when Victor finally departed, Pike felt certain of one thing. The man knew considerably more than he admitted. The second crime occurred the following morning. It happened shortly after dawn. A gardener employed at Blackwater House made the discovery. His screams brought servants running. Within minutes, the household was in chaos. And by 8 o'clock, Inspector Pike was racing toward the estate. The body lay beside an old stone well hidden among overgrown trees. The victim was male, approximately 70 years old. Death appeared recent. No obvious signs of struggle existed. Yet one fact immediately stood out. The dead man was Arthur Gresham, retired groundskeeper, former employee of Blackwater House, and one of the few surviving staff members who had worked there in 1939. Inspector Pike stood silently beside the body. The old man's face carried an expression of profound surprise, as though he had recognized the person responsible. That possibility troubled him greatly. A search of Arthur Gresham's cottage produced a remarkable discovery. Hidden inside a drawer beneath old gardening catalogues lay a bundle of letters. Most were ordinary. One was not. The unusual letter contained only a few lines. No signature, No date. No greeting, just a message. She has returned and is asking questions again. If she learns the truth, everything will come out. Inspector Pike read the note 3 times, then a 4th. The meaning was obvious. The woman from room 7 had been investigating something connected to Blackwater House. Someone knew she was asking questions. Someone feared what she might uncover. And now one of the last witnesses to the events of 1939 was dead. The coincidence was impossible to ignore. Late that evening, Miss Marple sat alone in the hotel lounge. Rain tapped softly against the windows. The room was nearly empty. Most guests had retired. Only the ticking clock disturbed the silence. She reflected upon Arthur Gresham's death. The old groundskeeper interested her, not because he had died, because of how he had lived. People often overlooked servants, gardeners, maids, caretakers. Yet such individuals observed everything: arguments, affairs, financial troubles, family quarrels. They noticed far more than their employers realized. If Arthur Gresham had known the truth about 1939, he might have carried that knowledge for decades. A secret buried for 19 years, a secret worth killing for. Miss Marple's knitting rested untouched upon her lap. For the first time since arriving in Brambleford, she felt she could glimpse the outline of the mystery. Only the outline. Not the full picture, but enough. Enough to suspect that the accusation against Clara Morton had never been the real story. Enough to suspect that somebody powerful had benefited from her disgrace. And enough to believe that the vanished woman from room 7 had come seeking something far more important than stolen jewellery. She had come seeking the truth. The question now was whether she had found it before she disappeared. Because if she had, the murderer might be far more desperate than anyone imagined. Chapter 5. The Letter Behind the Mirror. The murder of Arthur Gresham changed the atmosphere of Brambleford completely. A disappearance might inspire gossip. A death demanded caution. 2 linked mysteries, 1 vanished woman and 1 dead groundskeeper, created something far more unsettling. People locked doors that had rarely been locked before. Curtains were drawn earlier in the evening. Conversations stopped when strangers approached. The village was no longer merely curious. It was afraid. And fear, Miss Marple knew, often caused people to reveal more than they intended. The funeral director's assistant, a young man named Colin Reeves, unexpectedly provided the next clue. He arrived at the police station carrying an object wrapped in brown paper. Inspector Pike looked up from his desk. "What have you got there?" "A mirror." Pike blinked. "A mirror?" It came from Arthur Gresham's cottage. The assistant carefully unwrapped the object. It was an ordinary wall mirror with a dark wooden frame. Nothing remarkable, until Colin explained. "I was helping clear some belongings." "Yes?" The back panel came loose. Pike sat upright. "And?" "There was something hidden inside." The young man produced a folded envelope, a very old envelope, yellowed with age. The inspector immediately took it. Written across the front in faded ink were 3 words: "For Clara." Only Pike's pulse quickened. The letter inside had been written in 1939. The handwriting belonged to a woman. Several passages had faded, but most remained legible. The inspector read slowly. As he progressed, his expression hardened. Then he read it again. Finally, he reached for the telephone. "Get me Blackwater House." An hour later, Miss Marple sat opposite Inspector Pike in his office. The letter lay between them. "You wish to show me something?" The inspector nodded. "I believe we've discovered why Clara Morton returned." Miss Marple adjusted her spectacles. "Indeed?" Pike handed over the document. She began reading. The letter was signed by a former housemaid named Elsie Warren. Its contents were astonishing. Nearly 20 years earlier, Clara Morton had been accused of stealing valuable jewellery belonging to the Pennington family. According to the letter, however, Clara had not been responsible. Someone else had taken the jewels. Someone within Blackwater House. Someone protected by another member of the household. The accusation against Clara had been fabricated, a convenient sacrifice, a servant dismissed to preserve a far more important reputation. Miss Marple finished reading and folded the paper carefully. How sad. Pike looked surprised. Sad? Very. She placed the letter on the desk. Imagine carrying such an injustice for 19 years. The inspector nodded slowly. He had been focused on the crime. Miss Marple had focused on the person. As usual. The most interesting part of the letter appeared near the end. Elsie Warren claimed she had witnessed an argument shortly before Clara's dismissal. The participants were never named directly. However, one sentence stood out. The young gentleman swore his mother would protect him, no matter the cost. Pike tapped the page. The young gentleman, Miss Marple nodded. Yes. There weren't many young gentlemen living at Blackwater House in 1939. No. The implication hung between them. Victor Hale had admitted his family once lived near the estate. His father had been employed there. He had known Clara Morton, and he appeared deeply uncomfortable whenever the subject arose. Inspector Pike suddenly possessed a reason to look much more closely at him. That afternoon he did exactly that. Victor Hale arrived looking annoyed. By the time the interview ended, annoyance had become anxiety. Pike showed him the letter. Victor read it silently. His face lost colour, not dramatically, not enough for a courtroom, enough for an experienced policeman. You recognize this? No. You're certain? Yes. Did your family know Clara Morton? Victor hesitated, then sighed. Everyone knew Clara. Why? Because people talked. What did they say? Victor looked away. The usual things. What things? That she was pretty. The answer seemed harmless, yet somehow important. Pike waited. Eventually Victor continued. Several men admired her. Among them? Victor remained silent. The inspector repeated the question. At last Victor answered. My father. The room grew very quiet. Victor explained reluctantly. His father, Richard Hale, had served as estate manager at Blackwater House before the war. According to Victor, Richard Hale had been infatuated with Clara Morton. The feelings were not returned. Many people knew it. The situation caused considerable gossip among servants. Then Clara was accused of theft and dismissed. The matter ended, or seemed to. Did your father believe she was guilty? Pike asked. Victor stared at the table. No. The answer emerged almost as a whisper. Why not? Because he told me she wasn't. Inspector Pike leaned forward. Then why didn't he speak? Victor gave a bitter laugh. My father spent his life keeping other people's secrets. The statement lingered in the air. It felt important, yet Victor refused to elaborate further. Meanwhile, Miss Marple paid another visit to Blackwater House. This time she was interested in architecture, or so she claimed. Mrs. Pennington appeared mildly puzzled, but agreed to show her around. The house contained long corridors, high ceilings, and countless family portraits. Miss Marple admired them all politely. Eventually, they reached a small sitting room overlooking the gardens. A large oil painting hung above the fireplace. The painting depicted the Pennington family shortly before the war. Miss Marple studied it carefully, then very carefully indeed. Something caught her attention, not the people, the arrangement, the relationships, who stood beside whom, who did not. Mrs. Pennington noticed her interest. A family portrait. Quite lovely. It was painted in 1938. Miss Marple smiled. One can learn a great deal from old photographs and paintings. Can one? Oh yes. She continued studying the image. A thought began forming. Small, incomplete, yet intriguing. She filed it away for later consideration. That evening, another witness emerged unexpectedly. A retired postmistress, named Agnes Crowley, requested a private meeting. Miss Marple received her in the hotel lounge. The elderly woman appeared nervous. I don't know whether this matters. It often does. Agnes clasped her hands. I recognized the photograph. The photograph of Clara. Yes. Miss Marple waited. Agnes lowered her voice. She visited the post office 3 times. When, shortly before she disappeared, what was she doing? Sending letters. The answer was not surprising. The next detail was registered letters. Miss Marple became attentive. To whom? I don't know. Why remember them? Agnes hesitated. Because she seemed frightened. The room fell silent. Miss Marple's eyes narrowed slightly. Frightened of what? I couldn't say. Did she mail many letters? 3. On separate days? Yes. Agnes nodded. And each time she checked twice to make certain they had been properly recorded. That detail interested Miss Marple greatly. People expecting trouble often took precautions. 3 registered letters suggested planning, preparation, insurance, as though Clara Morton feared something might happen to her, and wanted information delivered elsewhere if it did. Later that night, Miss Marple sat beside the hotel fire. The flames crackled softly. Outside, rain drifted across the darkened streets. Her thoughts returned to the missing woman, not Helena March, Clara Morton, a woman falsely accused in 1939, a woman who had returned nearly 2 decades later, a woman who apparently mailed several registered letters before vanishing. Why? The answer seemed increasingly obvious. Because she had expected danger. Perhaps not murder, perhaps not disappearance, but danger. Enough danger to prepare safeguards. Miss Marple smiled faintly. That realization comforted her. Not because Clara was safe, there was no evidence of that, but because careful people often left traces, messages, instructions, copies, records. And Clara Morton struck her as a very careful woman indeed. Someone who had spent 19 years waiting for the proper moment. Someone who would not return to Brambleford without protection. The question was where that protection lay, and who would find it first. Because somewhere in the village another person was asking exactly the same question. A person growing steadily more desperate. A person who had already stolen a notebook from room 7, and perhaps committed murder to keep old secrets buried. Miss Marple gazed into the fire. She felt increasingly certain that the mystery's heart lay not in the disappearance itself. The disappearance was merely the final act. The true story had begun in 1939, and every day brought them closer to understanding what had really happened inside Blackwater House all those years ago. Chapter 6. The 3 Registered Letters. On Thursday morning, Brambleford awoke to bright sunshine. After days of rain and uncertainty, the village seemed eager to convince itself that everything would soon return to normal. The market square bustled. Shopkeepers swept their doorways. Children chased one another between stalls. For a few hours, ordinary life attempted to reassert itself. Yet beneath the surface, the mystery remained, and by lunchtime, it would take another unexpected turn. Inspector Pike was reviewing witness statements when Sergeant Wilkes entered carrying a telegram. "You'll want this." Pike accepted it. The message had been forwarded from London. Its contents were brief. Registered letter received. Recipient requests immediate police contact regarding Clara Morton. The inspector sat upright. At last, one of the letters. He read the telegram twice before reaching for his coat. The recipient arrived in Brambleford that afternoon. Her name was Margaret Ellis. She was 45 years old, neatly dressed and visibly nervous. The meeting took place in the police station interview room. Inspector Pike offered tea. She declined. Her hands trembled slightly. "You received a registered letter?" "Yes." "From Clara Morton?" Margaret nodded. The inspector exchanged a glance with Sergeant Wilkes. "How well did you know her?" The woman hesitated, then answered quietly, "She was my mother." Silence filled the room. Pike stared. "Your mother?" "Yes." The answer seemed impossible and yet immediately explained several mysteries. Clara Morton had vanished from public life after leaving Blackwater House. She had apparently built a new existence elsewhere, A new name, a new family, a new life. The inspector leaned forward. When did you last see her? 3 weeks ago. What did she tell you? Margaret removed an envelope from her handbag. She said that if this letter arrived, something had gone wrong. The room became very still. Pike carefully opened the envelope. Inside were several handwritten pages. At the top appeared a date. 6 days before Clara's disappearance. The first line read, "If you are reading this, I have either disappeared or been prevented from speaking." Inspector Pike felt a chill that had nothing to do with the weather. The statement contained no direct accusations. Clara had been careful, very careful. Instead, she described her reasons for returning to Brambleford. For years, she had believed herself falsely accused. Then, shortly before Christmas, she had discovered evidence suggesting the truth remained hidden at Blackwater House. The letter referred repeatedly to a family secret. A secret connected not merely to the missing jewellery, but to someone's true identity. One passage particularly attracted Pike's attention. The theft itself mattered less than what it concealed. They could not allow certain facts to become public. Even now, after all these years, someone is afraid. The inspector read the sentence several times. Identity, fear, concealment. The same themes appeared repeatedly. Yet Clara still avoided naming names, as though she feared the letter might be intercepted, which, Pike reflected, was entirely sensible. When Miss Marple learned of the letter, she requested permission to examine it. The inspector agreed. They met later that evening in the lounge of the White Heather. Miss Marple read every page slowly. When she finished, she folded the document carefully. "Well?" Pike asked. She looked thoughtful. She was protecting someone. "Who?" "I don't know." "How can you tell?" Miss Marple tapped a paragraph. "Because she repeatedly avoids certain names. That proves nothing." "On the contrary," she smiled gently. "It proves quite a lot." The inspector waited. Miss Marple continued. "People writing private letters generally name individuals freely. Clara does not. She circles around them. Meaning she feared the wrong person reading the letter." The inspector frowned. "Reasonable enough." "More than reasonable." Miss Marple gazed into the fire. She expected betrayal. Another clue emerged from an unlikely source. The manager of a small boarding house in London contacted the police. Several years earlier, Clara Morton had rented a room there under a different surname. Nothing unusual about that. What interested Inspector Pike was the name she had chosen. For nearly 15 years she had lived as Clara Ellis, the same surname carried by her daughter. A simple enough detail, yet records showed she abandoned that identity only months before arriving in Brambleford. Then she adopted the name Helena March. Why? Why discard a perfectly safe identity? Why assume the identity of a dead woman? Inspector Pike found himself returning repeatedly to the same question. Miss Marple, however, approached the matter differently. She focused not on the name Clara adopted, but on the timing. The following morning she visited the village records office. The clerk greeted her warmly. Miss Marple had a remarkable ability to persuade people that helping her was entirely their own idea. Within an hour she was examining old electoral records, census extracts, and parish documents. Most revealed nothing. Then she found something interesting. Very interesting indeed. A birth record. The date corresponded to late 1939. The mother's name was missing. The father's name absent as well. Yet, one detail stood out. The child had been born unusually close to the period of Clara Morton's dismissal. Miss Marple copied several notes, then sat quietly for a long time. A possibility had entered her mind, a possibility she disliked. Not because it seemed unlikely, because it seemed increasingly likely. That afternoon, Inspector Pike interviewed Dr. Simon Farrow again. The local physician remained calm throughout. Perhaps too calm. "Did you know Clara Morton?" "No." "Did you know the woman calling herself Helena March?" "Only slightly." "You spoke with her?" "Briefly." "What about?" "Health matters." Pike watched him carefully. What health matters? The doctor smiled faintly. Patient confidentiality. The inspector's expression hardened. This is a murder investigation. Then obtain a warrant. The answer irritated Pike immensely, yet the doctor remained composed. Too composed. Afterward, the inspector noted something peculiar. Dr. Farrow never denied knowing more than he admitted. He simply refused to discuss it. There was a difference, and differences mattered. Meanwhile, Victor Hale appeared increasingly agitated. Several villagers noticed him arguing with someone near the churchyard. Unfortunately, nobody heard enough to identify the other participant. Others reported seeing him walking late at night. One witness claimed he visited the grounds of Blackwater House after midnight. Another insisted he was nowhere near the estate. The accounts contradicted one another completely. Yet one fact remained clear. Victor Hale was worried. Very worried. The reason remained uncertain. Whether fear made him guilty or merely frightened was another matter entirely. 2 days later, the second registered letter surfaced. This time the recipient was a solicitor in Manchester. His office forwarded the contents directly to Inspector Pike. The package contained copies of old correspondence. Most appeared harmless. One did not. It was a letter dated August 1939. The signature had faded. The contents, however, remained clear. The writer referred to the child whose existence must never become public knowledge. Inspector Pike read the sentence repeatedly. Then the next line, "If Clara speaks, everything will be ruined." For several moments he simply stared. The implications were enormous. The accusation against Clara Morton had apparently coincided with another secret. A child. A concealed identity. Something capable of causing scandal within Blackwater House. Suddenly the theft seemed far less important than anyone had assumed. Perhaps it had never been the central issue at all. Perhaps it had merely provided a convenient excuse. That evening, Inspector Pike and Miss Marple met once more. The second letter lay between them. The fire burned low. Outside, darkness settled across the village. "The child," Pike said. "Yes, you've been thinking about that." Miss Marple smiled. "A little. You have a theory, a possibility." The inspector sighed. She always had possibilities, rarely conclusions. "What possibility?" Miss Marple folded her hands. "Suppose the jewellery theft was invented. Go on. Suppose Clara knew something dangerous, such as a birth." The inspector remained silent. Miss Marple continued. "A hidden relationship, a child, a matter capable of causing considerable embarrassment in 1939. That still doesn't explain murder." "No." Her expression became thoughtful. "But it explains fear." The inspector nodded slowly. "Fear." Again and again the investigation returned to fear. Fear powerful enough to destroy a servant's reputation. Fear capable of surviving nearly 20 years. Fear strong enough to provoke theft, deception, and perhaps murder. The pattern was becoming clearer. Not complete, but clearer. Later that night, Miss Marple sat beside her bedroom window. Moonlight silvered the rooftops below. Somewhere in Brambleford, she suspected, a person was losing control. The careful arrangements of decades were beginning to unravel. Old lies were surfacing. Old witnesses had spoken. Old secrets had returned. And there was still one registered letter left unopened. One final message Clara Morton had prepared before disappearing. Miss Marple felt increasingly certain that the third letter would contain the key. Because Clara had been methodical, the first letter established danger. The second pointed toward motive. The third, she suspected, would reveal purpose. And once purpose became clear, the identity of the murderer might follow naturally. For human beings, she reflected, were wonderfully predictable creatures, especially when protecting something they believed belonged to them, or protecting a truth they could not afford to lose. Chapter 7. The Child. No one was meant to know. The third registered letter arrived on a Monday morning. Unlike the previous two, it had not been sent to a family member or solicitor. It had been addressed to a newspaper editor in London. The editor, uncertain of its significance at first, had opened it only after reading national reports about the Brambleford investigation. Within hours, he contacted Inspector Pike. By midday, a copy of the contents was on its way to the village. By 3 o'clock, Inspector Pike was reading it for the third time, and each reading made him more uneasy. The letter was longer than the others, far longer. Unlike the first two, Clara Morton seemed to have written it with the expectation that strangers might eventually see it. The language was careful, measured, precise. She avoided accusations she could not prove, yet she documented observations, dates, and conversations from 1939. Most importantly, she described the existence of a child whose birth had been concealed from the public, a child connected directly to Blackwater House. Near the end appeared a remarkable statement. The theft accusation was never about jewellery. It was created to remove me because I knew something I was not supposed to know. Inspector Pike leaned back. The room felt suddenly smaller. Everything was beginning to align. The false accusation, the decades of silence. The return to Brambleford, the fear, the disappearance, the murder of Arthur Gresham. The pattern now pointed in a single direction. Someone had been protecting an old secret for 19 years. Yet one crucial question remained. Who was the child? Clara's letter hinted repeatedly at the answer, but frustratingly, she never stated it outright. Several names were omitted. Several passages referred only to the family, as though Clara remained cautious even while preparing for danger. The final page ended abruptly, not because it was incomplete, because she had deliberately stopped. The last sentence read, "The proof exists. If anything happens to me, the truth can still be found." No explanation followed, no location, no clue, nothing. Inspector Pike stared at the words, then muttered a phrase not generally considered suitable for official reports. That evening he carried all 3 letters to the White Heather Hotel. Miss Marple was waiting in the lounge. She listened quietly as he summarized the latest developments. When he finished, she requested the letters. For nearly half an hour she read in silence. Pike occupied himself with tea and impatience. Finally she looked up. "Interesting," the inspector sighed. "Whenever you say that, I know I'm going to be frustrated," Miss Marple smiled. "Quite possibly." She arranged the letters carefully. Clara expected danger. Obviously. More than that, Miss Marple tapped the second letter. She expected a specific danger. Pike frowned. "What do you mean?" "She believed someone would try to stop her." "That's hardly surprising." "No." Miss Marple's eyes narrowed thoughtfully. "But she never expected the danger to come from a stranger." The inspector considered this. "You think she knew the person responsible?" "I think she suspected them." The distinction mattered very much. The following morning brought another revelation. A retired nurse from a neighbouring town contacted the police. Her name was Dorothy Keene. She was 71 years old, and she remembered events from 1939 remarkably well. Inspector Pike travelled to meet her personally. The elderly woman lived in a small cottage surrounded by roses. Her memory remained impressively sharp. When shown photographs connected to the investigation, she immediately recognized Blackwater House. "I attended a confinement there." Pike sat forward. "A confinement?" "Yes." The nurse folded her hands. "In September 1939, the inspector felt his pulse quicken, a date that matched perfectly. A child was born?" "Yes." "To whom?" The old woman hesitated. For the first time, uncertainty entered her expression. "That's difficult." "Difficult?" The arrangements were unusual. Pike waited. Finally she continued, "I was instructed not to ask questions." That sentence immediately attracted his attention. People paid not to ask questions often remembered them very clearly. The nurse recalled arriving after dark. The mother had remained isolated from most household staff. Several servants had been sent away temporarily. Privacy had been emphasized repeatedly. When the child was born, only a handful of people were present. Then came the most interesting detail. The infant was removed from Blackwater House within days. No official announcement followed. No public acknowledgement. No local records connected the child to the family. It was as though the birth had never occurred. Inspector Pike remained silent for several moments, then asked, "Do you know what became of the child?" The nurse shook her head. "No. Do you know who the mother was?" Another hesitation, longer this time. Finally she answered, "Not with certainty. But," the elderly woman sighed, "I had my suspicions." Unfortunately, her suspicions remained exactly that. Suspicions. Not evidence. Not proof. Yet they strengthened the emerging picture. Someone at Blackwater House had gone to extraordinary lengths to conceal a birth. Someone had feared scandal. Someone had possessed enough influence to silence questions. The implications reached far beyond a stolen necklace. Indeed, Inspector Pike increasingly doubted any necklace had ever mattered at all. Meanwhile, tension inside Blackwater House continued growing. Ruth Pennington appeared exhausted. Several servants reported hearing raised voices late at night. Visitors arrived unexpectedly. Meetings occurred behind closed doors. The household, once orderly, had become unsettled. Miss Marple learned these details through methods she never fully explained. People simply talked to her. They always had, and often revealed far more than intended. One particular conversation interested her greatly. The housekeeper, Mrs. Doyle, mentioned an argument between Ruth Pennington and Victor Hale. The quarrel had occurred in the library. Voices had been loud enough to carry through the corridor. Only fragments were overheard. Yet one sentence stood out. According to Mrs. Doyle, Victor shouted, "You should have told the truth years ago." The statement lingered in Miss Marple's mind. Not because of its content, because of its emotion. The anger sounded personal, deeply personal, the sort that accumulated over decades. That evening, Miss Marple walked through the village gardens. The summer air felt pleasant after days of rain. Children played near the bandstand. Elderly couples occupied benches. Ordinary life continued despite murder and mystery. It always did. Human beings possessed a remarkable ability to adapt. As she passed the churchyard, she noticed someone sitting alone near the old yew tree. Victor Hale. He appeared tired, older than before. The confident composure he normally displayed seemed absent. After a brief hesitation, Miss Marple approached. "Good evening." Victor looked up. "Miss Marple, may I sit?" He nodded. For a time neither spoke. Eventually Miss Marple said, "You seem troubled." Victor laughed quietly. "Aren't we all? Some more than others." The remark earned a faint smile. Then silence returned. Finally Victor spoke. "Do you know the worst thing about secrets?" Miss Marple waited. "They don't stay where they belong." The answer interested her greatly. "You've had experience of that?" His expression darkened. "More than enough." Miss Marple studied him carefully. She sensed genuine pain. Not fear. Pain. The difference mattered. Very much. Before she could ask another question, Victor stood. "I should go." "Of course." He hesitated, then added, "If Clara Morton found what she was looking for." He stopped. Miss Marple looked at him expectantly. "What then?" Victor stared toward the distant lights of Blackwater House. For several moments he said nothing, then quietly replied, "Then someone has been lying about everything." Without another word, he walked away. Later that night, another crime nearly occurred. Dr. Simon Farrow was returning home after visiting a patient when a motor car emerged suddenly from a side road. The vehicle accelerated directly toward him. Only a desperate leap into a hedge saved his life. The car vanished into darkness. No license number was obtained. No witnesses identified the driver. Yet one conclusion seemed unavoidable. The incident was no accident. Someone had attempted to kill him. When Inspector Pike arrived shortly afterward, the doctor appeared shaken for the first time since the investigation began, very shaken. "What aren't you telling me?" Pike demanded. Dr. Farrow looked away. The silence lasted nearly 10 seconds. Then he answered, "I can't. Can't or won't." The doctor met his gaze. For the first time, genuine fear appeared on his face. "If I speak now, someone else may die." That statement haunted Inspector Pike throughout the night, because it implied something crucial. Dr. Farrow knew part of the truth. Enough truth to make him dangerous. Enough truth to make someone want him dead. The circle was tightening. The suspects were narrowing. The old secret was surfacing, and for the first time Pike sensed that the mystery was entering its final phase. Elsewhere, Miss Marple sat awake long after midnight. Several pieces of the puzzle had finally fallen into place. Not all, but enough. She thought about Clara Morton, the hidden child, Victor Hale's anger, Ruth Pennington's fear, Dr. Farrow's silence, and one small detail from the family portrait she had examined days earlier, a detail everyone else had overlooked, a detail so ordinary that most people would never consider its significance. Miss Marple smiled faintly. Human nature, she reflected, rarely changed. People lied, people concealed, people protected those they loved, but they almost never anticipated which tiny detail would eventually betray them. And somewhere inside Blackwater House, one such detail had waited nearly 20 years to be noticed. Chapter 8. The Portrait Above the Fireplace. Miss Marple awoke earlier than usual the following morning. Not because she was restless, quite the opposite. For the first time since arriving in Brambleford, she felt a quiet certainty taking shape. The mystery was not solved. Not entirely. Several crucial pieces remained missing. Yet the outline had become clear, and whenever that happened, Miss Marple preferred to act before events overtook her. Murderers, she had observed over the years, often became most dangerous when they sensed their secrets slipping away. Shortly after breakfast, she paid another visit to Blackwater House. Mrs. Ruth Pennington appeared surprised, perhaps even slightly alarmed. "Miss Marple, good morning. I'm afraid Inspector Pike isn't here. I haven't come to see the inspector." The older woman hesitated. "Then why have you come?" Miss Marple smiled pleasantly. "To look at a painting." The answer seemed so absurd that Mrs. Pennington could only stare. A few minutes later, they stood once more, inside the sitting room. Sunlight streamed through the tall windows. The large family portrait hung above the fireplace exactly as before. Miss Marple studied it quietly, then stepped closer, very close. Mrs. Pennington watched uneasily. Finally, she asked, "What exactly interests you?" "The arrangement." "The arrangement?" "Yes." Miss Marple tilted her head. "It's curious." "I fail to see how." Most people would. The answer was not intended as an insult, yet it clearly felt like one. Mrs. Pennington's expression hardened. Miss Marple continued studying the painting. Then she pointed. "There." The widow followed her gaze. "I don't understand." "No." Miss Marple nodded gently. "I imagine very few people would." The clue was absurdly simple. So simple that Inspector Pike later felt irritated for missing it. The portrait depicted members of the Pennington family gathered on the lawn. Yet one individual stood slightly apart from the others, a young woman. Perhaps 20 years old, beautiful, dark-haired, elegant. Unlike the others, she was positioned at the edge of the group, almost excluded, yet not entirely. Miss Marple had examined family portraits throughout her life. People unconsciously revealed relationships through positioning, who stood together, who touched, who smiled, who remained distant. In this painting, the young woman occupied an unusual place, neither family nor servant, neither outsider nor insider, something in between, and that suggested a story. Who was she? Miss Marple asked. Mrs. Pennington remained silent. The young woman, still silence. Miss Marple looked toward her. For a moment neither spoke. Then the widow sighed, a long, weary sigh. Her name was Evelyn Pennington. Miss Marple waited. She was my younger sister. There it was. The first crack, small but important. Inspector Pike arrived shortly afterward. Miss Marple requested that he join them. The atmosphere inside the room became distinctly uncomfortable. Ruth Pennington sat rigidly in her chair. The inspector remained standing. Miss Marple occupied the sofa with apparent serenity. No one else appeared remotely serene. "Evelyn Pennington," said Pike. "We found references to her." Mrs. Pennington nodded. "She died." "When?" 1940. "How?" "Illness." The answer came too quickly. Miss Marple noticed. So did Pike. Neither commented. The conversation might have ended there, except that Miss Marple asked another question, a deceptively simple one. Was Evelyn happy? The widow looked startled. Happy? Yes. The question lingered. Finally, Ruth Pennington replied quietly, no. For the first time since the investigation began, genuine sadness entered her voice. Not fear, not defensiveness, sadness. Miss Marple listened carefully. People often became most truthful when speaking about grief. After a lengthy silence, Mrs. Pennington rose. She crossed the room toward a writing desk. For several moments, she stood with her back turned. Then she opened a drawer. When she returned, she carried a small photograph. She handed it to Inspector Pike. The image showed a young woman, dark-haired, beautiful, and unmistakably pregnant. Pike stared. The photograph had been taken during the summer of 1939. The implications were obvious. He looked up. "Evelyn?" The widow nodded. No one spoke. At last, the hidden child, the concealed birth, the scandal. Everything suddenly seemed much closer, yet not close enough, because one critical question remained. What became of the child? Pike asked it directly. Mrs. Pennington closed her eyes. When she answered, her voice sounded exhausted. "I don't know." The inspector frowned. "You don't know?" "No. How is that possible?" The widow laughed bitterly. A great many foolish decisions were made in those days. Miss Marple said nothing. She merely listened and watched. Later that afternoon, another piece of the puzzle arrived unexpectedly. Dr. Simon Farrow requested a private meeting. Not at the police station, not at Blackwater House. At the church. The location struck Inspector Pike as peculiar. It struck Miss Marple as revealing. People often chose churches when burdened by guilt, or conscience, or both. The meeting took place inside the small vestry behind the chapel. Dr. Farrow appeared exhausted. The attempt on his life had clearly affected him. After several moments he spoke. "I can't keep silent any longer." Inspector Pike folded his arms. That would be a welcome change. The doctor ignored the remark. Instead, he looked directly at Miss Marple. "You already know part of it." Miss Marple smiled faintly. "Only part." Dr. Farrow nodded, then took a deep breath. "My father was the village doctor in 1939. The statement immediately captured attention. He attended the birth." Pike sat forward. "The birth at Blackwater House?" "Yes." The doctor looked toward the stained glass window. He left notes. "What sort of notes?" "Private notes." "Medical?" "Partly." The answer troubled Pike. Partly medical suggested partly something else. Something personal. Dr. Farrow continued. "Evelyn Pennington gave birth to a healthy boy." The room became silent. The hidden child finally had a gender, a real existence. A place in the story. The doctor swallowed. "My father kept records because he feared future disputes." "Disputes?" asked Pike. "About identity." Again that word. Identity. It had haunted the investigation from the beginning. "What happened to the child?" asked Miss Marple. Dr. Farrow hesitated. For several seconds he appeared genuinely reluctant. Then he answered, "The child survived." Pike frowned. "We already assumed that. You don't understand." The doctor looked directly at him. "The child is still alive." Neither Miss Marple nor the inspector reacted visibly. Internally, however, both experienced the same realization. The hidden child was no longer merely part of history. He was part of the present, very possibly part of the village itself. Dr. Farrow reached into his briefcase. Carefully, he withdrew a sealed envelope. "My father left instructions." Pike accepted it. The paper felt surprisingly heavy. "What's inside?" The doctor looked pale. "Proof." "Proof of what?" The answer emerged quietly. "The child's identity." The room fell completely silent. For several moments no one moved. Then Inspector Pike broke the seal. Inside lay a folded document. A birth record, several handwritten notes, and one name, a single name, the identity of the child hidden for 19 years. Pike stared, then read it again, slowly, very slowly. Across the room, Miss Marple watched his expression change. Shock, disbelief, then understanding. The inspector lowered the document. For perhaps the first time in his career he seemed genuinely speechless. Miss Marple knew immediately what that meant. The answer had not merely been surprising, it had overturned assumptions, perhaps all of them. At last Pike looked up. His voice sounded different, quieter. Heavens! Miss Marple met his gaze. She needed no explanation. The truth was already visible on his face. The hidden child was not a stranger, not someone living far away, not someone forgotten by history. The hidden child was one of the people already standing at the center of the mystery. Someone known, someone respected, someone whose entire life rested upon a lie. And if Clara Morton had discovered that truth, then her disappearance suddenly made perfect sense. Because exposure would have destroyed everything. Everything. Chapter 9. The Night at the Boathouse. Inspector Pike did not sleep well. The revelation contained within Dr. Farrow's envelope had transformed the investigation entirely. For hours he sat in his office reviewing notes, witness statements, photographs and records. Again and again he arrived at the same conclusion. The evidence fit, disturbingly well, perhaps too well, because if the documents were genuine, and there was every reason to believe they were, then one of the central figures in the case had unknowingly lived beneath a false history for nearly 20 years, and Clara Morton had discovered it. At last, the reason for her return, the reason for the fear, the reason for the murder. Everything pointed toward that hidden truth. The following morning, Miss Marple arrived at the police station. She found Pike staring at the birth record. Still considering it, the inspector gave a weary smile. Considering, doubting, reconsidering. A healthy process. He handed her the document. Miss Marple read it carefully, then folded it. Neither spoke for a moment. Finally Pike said, "It was Victor Hale." Miss Marple nodded. The secret child had a name. At last. In September of 1939, Evelyn Pennington had given birth to a son. The birth had been concealed. The infant removed, his identity altered, official records obscured. The child had eventually been raised under another name, Victor Hale, the handsome hotel guest, the man who had appeared increasingly troubled throughout the investigation, the man who had repeatedly demanded the truth, the man who, until recently, had never known who he truly was. What did Clara discover? Pike asked. Miss Marple considered. Not merely that Victor existed. No. She folded her hands. Many people could have guessed that. The inspector frowned. Then what? Miss Marple looked toward the window. She discovered who arranged the deception. The room fell silent. Because there was an important distinction. Concealing a birth required planning. Records did not alter themselves. Witnesses did not silence themselves. Children did not vanish from official history by accident. Someone had orchestrated it. Someone with influence. Someone with motive. someone frightened enough to destroy a servant's reputation to protect the secret. Meanwhile, Victor Hale sat alone in his room at the White Heather Hotel. He had received an unexpected visitor, Mrs. Ruth Pennington. The meeting lasted nearly an hour. No witnesses overheard everything, yet fragments emerged later, raised voices, accusations, long silences. At one point, Victor reportedly shouted, "You stole my life." At another, Mrs. Pennington replied, "I saved it." Neither statement was fully understood at the time. Later, they would seem enormously important. That afternoon, a fisherman made a discovery. The man had spent years working along Blackwater Lake, situated less than a mile from the estate. While checking equipment near an abandoned boathouse, he noticed something unusual beneath a cluster of reeds. A woman's shoe, old, weathered, yet unmistakably recent. The police were summoned immediately. Inspector Pike arrived within the hour. The boathouse stood at the edge of the lake, partially hidden by overgrown trees. Few people visited it now. Its planks had begun to rot. The roof sagged. One window was broken. Inside, dust covered most surfaces, except one. Near the rear wall, signs of recent activity remained visible. Footprints, disturbed dirt, and something else, a faint dark stain. Pike crouched, his expression hardened. He knew immediately what he was looking at. A more thorough search followed. The results were grim. Additional evidence suggested a violent struggle had occurred there. Not recently, several days earlier. The approximate timing matched Clara Morton's disappearance almost perfectly. The inspector stood silently for several moments. The missing woman had not vanished voluntarily. That possibility could now be discarded. Something had happened inside the boathouse. Something serious, perhaps fatal. Yet no body had been found. Not yet. When Miss Marple learned of the discovery, she asked an unusual question. Was the shoe damaged? Inspector Pike blinked. The shoe? Yes, it was muddy. Anything else? The inspector consulted his notes. The heel was broken. Miss Marple nodded thoughtfully. Interesting. Why? She smiled. Because people often reveal themselves through what they choose to repair. The answer made no sense whatsoever, at least not immediately. The true significance emerged later that evening. Miss Marple requested permission to examine the shoe personally. After studying it for several minutes, she asked to see Mrs. Pennington. The request surprised Inspector Pike. It surprised Mrs. Pennington even more. Nevertheless, the meeting was arranged. Blackwater House felt different now. The servants moved quietly. The atmosphere carried the unmistakable weight of approaching disaster. Secrets long buried were surfacing. Everyone seemed aware of it. No one wished to discuss it. Miss Marple entered the drawing room carrying the recovered shoe. Mrs. Pennington stared at it. For the briefest moment, genuine shock crossed her face, then vanished. Too late. Miss Marple had seen it. So, said the older woman carefully, they found something. Yes. Silence. Neither moved. Finally, Miss Marple spoke. Clara visited the boathouse. The widow said nothing. Someone met her there. Still nothing. Miss Marple continued. The meeting did not go as planned. For several seconds, Mrs. Pennington simply stared into the fire. Then she asked, "Do you know what happened?" Miss Marple smiled gently. No. The answer was truthful, at least partly. She did not know exactly what happened. Not yet. But she knew enough. Enough to observe reactions. Enough to test them. Enough to see fear when it appeared. And fear had appeared. Very clearly. Later that night, Inspector Pike received another surprise. Dr. Farrow arrived carrying a small notebook. The notebook had belonged to his late father. For years, it had remained among personal papers. Only now had its significance become obvious. The doctor placed it on the desk. "You should read page 42. Pike did, and immediately sat upright. The entry concerned Evelyn Pennington. More specifically, it concerned the period shortly after Victor's birth. One sentence stood out. Miss R.P. insists no one must ever learn the boy's true parentage. The initials required no interpretation. Ruth Pennington. The inspector read the line again, then another, and another. The notebook suggested that Evelyn had not willingly surrendered her child. The separation had been arranged, perhaps even forced. The implications were staggering. That same evening, Miss Marple took a walk near Blackwater Lake, not because she enjoyed walking in darkness, quite the opposite, but she wished to examine the area surrounding the boathouse. The moon reflected across the water. Wind stirred the reeds. The abandoned structure stood silent against the shoreline. She approached slowly, then stopped. Someone was already there. A figure emerged from the shadows, tall, male, motionless. For a brief moment, neither spoke. Then the man stepped forward. Victor Hale. He looked exhausted, older, as though the past week had aged him considerably. "I thought I might find you here," he said. Miss Marple nodded. "And why is that?" "Because you're close." The answer was immediate, honest. Perhaps the most honest thing he had said since arriving in Brambleford. For several minutes they stood overlooking the lake. Finally Victor spoke again. "My entire life was a lie." Miss Marple said nothing. People often continued speaking when not interrupted. Victor proved no exception. "I always knew something felt wrong. Many adopted children do." He looked surprised. "You knew?" "My dear Mr. Hale, I've known for several days." A faint laugh escaped him. Not amused, merely resigned. "What happens now?" he asked. Miss Marple considered. "The truth." Victor stared across the dark water. "That sounds simple. It rarely is." "No," he smiled bitterly. "It never is." As they prepared to leave, Miss Marple noticed something, a reflection, a faint glimmer among the reeds near the shoreline, something metallic, half-hidden. Most people would have ignored it. Miss Marple did not. She moved closer, then bent carefully. A moment later she lifted a small object from the mud, a brooch, old-fashioned, silver, decorated with tiny blue stones. The piece was damaged. One clasp bent sharply inward, as though caught during a struggle. Miss Marple examined it quietly, then looked toward the boathouse. A thought formed immediately, a very important thought, because she had seen the brooch before, not recently, not in person, in a photograph taken many years earlier, a photograph hanging above a fireplace in Blackwater House, and the woman wearing it had been Evelyn Pennington. For the first time, Miss Marple felt certain she understood what had happened after Clara Morton disappeared. Not every detail, not yet, but enough. Enough to recognize the pattern, enough to see how the old secret connected to the modern crime, enough to identify the mistake, because murderers often succeeded through planning, yet they almost always failed through emotion. And somewhere beside Blackwater Lake, 19 years of fear had finally collided with 19 years of guilt. The result, Miss Marple suspected, had been fatal. Chapter 10. Miss Marple's Final Test. The discovery of Evelyn Pennington's brooch changed everything. Not because it proved murder, not because it identified the killer, not even because it explained Clara Morton's disappearance. It changed everything because it revealed something far more valuable: emotion. Miss Marple had long maintained that crimes were rarely solved by objects alone. Objects merely pointed toward people. And people, with all their fears, loyalties, resentments, and affections, ultimately provided the answers. The brooch told her one thing with certainty: someone connected intimately to Evelyn Pennington had been present at Blackwater Lake. Someone whose emotions remained entangled with events from 1939, and that narrowed the field considerably. The following morning, Inspector Pike arrived at the White Heather carrying troubling news. The lake had finally yielded another clue. Divers searching near the boathouse discovered a handbag buried beneath silt and weeds. The contents had suffered water damage, yet enough remained intact for identification. It belonged to Clara Morton, the missing woman. At last, definitive proof. She had reached the lake, she had entered the boathouse, and she had never left willingly. Pike placed several recovered items on a table: a compact mirror, a handkerchief, a damaged key case, and a small folded paper protected inside a waxed envelope. Miss Marple immediately focused upon the paper. Was anything written on it? Yes. The inspector handed it over. The note contained only a few lines, apparently written shortly before Clara disappeared. The handwriting was hurried, yet legible. Meeting tonight. Final proof. If I am right, everything changes. No name, no location, nothing else. Yet Miss Marple smiled faintly. That's rather helpful. Pike stared. Helpful? Very. How? Because Clara expected a meeting. The inspector sighed. That much is obvious. Yes. Miss Marple folded the note. But she expected the person to cooperate. That observation stopped him, because she was right. The wording implied anticipation. Not fear, not caution. Expectation. Clara had gone to the meeting believing she would finally obtain confirmation, not confrontation. Meanwhile, Victor Hale had withdrawn almost entirely from village life. The revelations surrounding his birth had shaken him profoundly. Several witnesses reported seeing him wandering alone. Others observed him spending hours near the churchyard. The confident businessman who had first arrived at the White Heather seemed to have vanished. In his place remained a man attempting to understand who he truly was. Miss Marple sympathized. Identity, she reflected, was a fragile thing. People built entire lives upon assumptions. When those assumptions collapsed, the consequences could be devastating. That afternoon she requested a meeting with Ruth Pennington. The widow appeared exhausted. Dark circles framed her eyes. Her posture seemed diminished, as though years had settled upon her shoulders in a matter of days. Miss Marple accepted tea, then waited. Patience often encouraged confessions more effectively than interrogation. Eventually Ruth spoke first. "Do you know?" Miss Marple looked up. "Know what?" "The truth." The question lingered. Miss Marple considered her answer carefully. "Not entirely." The widow laughed softly. A diplomatic response. An honest one. For several moments silence prevailed. Then Ruth said, "I loved my sister." The statement emerged unexpectedly, without warning, without context. Yet Miss Marple immediately recognized its significance. Love. Whenever people began explanations with love, tragedy frequently followed. Evelyn was foolish, Ruth continued. Young, trusting. Her gaze drifted toward the window. When she became pregnant, she believed promises. Miss Marple remained silent. The promises proved worthless. The older woman's voice hardened slightly. Men often disappoint. Again silence. Then, I thought I was protecting her. There it was, the first genuine admission. Not of murder, not yet, but of responsibility. Responsibility for decisions made long ago, decisions that had altered multiple lives. Later that evening, Miss Marple met privately with Inspector Pike. She carried a small notebook, her own, filled with observations, dates, conversations, tiny details collected throughout the investigation. Pike examined her notes with increasing fascination. Several entries concerned matters he had barely noticed. Others involved comments dismissed as irrelevant. One particular page attracted his attention. At the top, Miss Marple had written, "What people repair reveals what they value." The inspector groaned. "The shoe again?" "Yes." "I still don't understand." Miss Marple smiled. "Most people discard damaged shoes." "Certainly. Especially expensive people." Pike blinked. She continued. The heel had been repaired twice. The significance remained unclear. Seeing his expression, Miss Marple elaborated. Clara Morton was practical, careful, economical. I'll accept that. The person she met was not. Now the inspector began to understand. A little. Miss Marple continued. The repaired shoe belonged to Clara. Yes, which means she walked willingly to the boathouse. The point struck home immediately. If someone had abducted Clara unexpectedly, she would not have chosen that route. She had arranged the meeting herself, and that mattered enormously. "Who was she meeting?" Pike asked. Miss Marple closed her notebook. "Someone she trusted." The answer produced another silence, because trust narrowed possibilities dramatically. The next stage of Miss Marple's plan began the following afternoon. She requested that several individuals attend a small gathering at Blackwater House. The invitation appeared harmless. A discussion of recent developments. Nothing unusual, nothing threatening. Inspector Pike understood immediately that it was neither harmless nor ordinary. Miss Marple was preparing something. He simply did not know what. The attendees included Ruth Pennington Victor Hale, Dr. Simon Farrow, Inspector Pike, Mrs. Doyle, the housekeeper. A modest group, exactly as Miss Marple intended. Large audiences encouraged performance. Small groups encouraged honesty. The meeting took place in the same sitting room where the family portrait hung above the fireplace. Sunlight filtered through the windows. Dust floated lazily through the air. At first, the conversation remained entirely ordinary. Miss Marple discussed the weather, the village, gardening, tea. Inspector Pike struggled not to look impatient. Victor appeared confused. Dr. Farrow remained cautious. Only Ruth Pennington seemed increasingly uneasy. She sensed something approaching, something unavoidable. Then Miss Marple introduced the subject of Clara Morton. The atmosphere changed immediately. Conversation stopped. No one touched their tea. No one smiled. No one moved. Perfect. Exactly as she had hoped. Clara was a very determined woman, Miss Marple said gently. After 19 years, she finally discovered the truth. Silence. She discovered what happened in 1939. Still silence. She also discovered who benefited. Victor looked sharply toward Ruth. The older woman stared at the carpet. Dr. Farrow remained motionless. Inspector Pike watched everyone. Miss Marple continued calmly. Unfortunately, Clara made a mistake. At last, someone spoke. "Victor, what mistake?" Miss Marple looked at him. She believed the guilty person wanted the truth. No one answered. The room felt suddenly smaller, warmer, heavier. Then Miss Marple produced the silver brooch, the one recovered near Blackwater Lake. For the first time, genuine alarm flashed across one face. Brief, very brief, yet unmistakable. Miss Marple saw it. Inspector Pike saw it. And perhaps most importantly, the owner of that reaction realized they had seen it. A mistake. A tiny mistake. But sometimes tiny mistakes destroyed entire, carefully constructed lives. Miss Marple said nothing further. Not yet. The trap was not complete. The final piece remained missing. One more pressure, one more observation, one more reaction. Then the truth would emerge. Because somewhere in that room sat the person who had met Clara Morton at the boathouse. The person who knew exactly what happened that night. The person who had spent nearly 20 years protecting a devastating secret. And now, for the first time, that person understood that Miss Marple was no longer guessing. She was very close to certainty. Very close indeed. Chapter 11. The silence in the sitting room had become almost unnatural. Not the polite silence of a drawing room after tea. Something heavier. Something held in place by fear rather than manners. Miss Marple remained seated, hands folded, expression mild. Yet nothing about her stillness suggested uncertainty. Inspector Pike, watching her closely, had begun to understand something uncomfortable. She was no longer exploring possibilities. She was confirming something she already knew. The silver brooch lay on the table between them. Small, ordinary to anyone who did not understand its significance. But in that room, it felt like a final piece of evidence that refused to be ignored. Miss Marple spoke softly. Clara Morton did not die at the boathouse. A faint shift passed through the room. Not dramatic, not obvious, but real. She was meeting someone she believed she could trust. Her eyes moved slowly from face to face. Someone from Blackwater House. Dr. Farrow exhaled quietly, almost inaudibly. Victor Hale did not move. Ruth Pennington stared into her teacup, as though it might provide an escape. Miss Marple continued. The meeting was not unexpected. She turned slightly toward Victor. In fact, it was arranged. Victor's jaw tightened. You think I arranged it? I think Clara arranged it. A pause, then gently, but only after receiving confirmation from you. The words landed heavily. Inspector Pike straightened. Victor's expression flickered. Confusion first, then something else. Recognition. Miss Marple leaned forward slightly. Clara Morton wrote 3 registered letters because she feared interference. She tapped the air lightly, as if counting. 1 to ensure her daughter could receive the truth. 1 to ensure a solicitor could verify records. And 1, her gaze sharpened, to ensure the newspaper would publish everything if she disappeared. The room felt colder. She came prepared. A pause. Because she already knew she might not be allowed to leave alive. Inspector Pike finally spoke. Then what happened at the boathouse? Miss Marple did not look at him. She was watching Ruth Pennington. Always Ruth Pennington. Clara discovered confirmation of what she suspected. Her voice remained calm. That Victor Hale was not merely Evelyn Pennington's son. A pause. But the living proof of a secret that had been maintained through deception, altered records, and a false accusation of theft. Victor's breath changed slightly. Shallow, controlled, but different. Miss Marple's voice remained gentle. The accusation against Clara Morton in 1939 was not about jewellery. She looked briefly toward the portrait above the fireplace. It was about removing someone who might expose the truth. A faint tremor passed through Ruth Pennington's hand. So the question, Miss Marple said quietly, is not what Clara discovered, her gaze returned, but what she threatened to reveal. Silence again. Then Inspector Pike said carefully, the child's identity. Miss Marple nodded once. Yes. Her tone softened. Victor Hale is Evelyn Pennington's son. A long pause. And Ruth Pennington's nephew. The words settled. Unavoidable. Final. Victor closed his eyes briefly. Ruth Pennington did not move. Dr. Farrow looked down. Miss Marple continued, but that alone does not explain murder. Her eyes lifted slightly. Nor does it explain Arthur Gresham's death. Inspector Pike tensed. Then what does? Miss Marple looked at Ruth Pennington again, this time longer, deliberately. Clara Morton learned something else. A pause. Something she did not include in her letters. The room remained frozen. Miss Marple reached into her handbag. She placed a second document on the table, a photocopy of the boathouse report, and beside it, a note recovered from Clara's belongings, only partially legible, but enough. Pike leaned forward. He read. His expression changed instantly. The note contained a single line Clara had written before meeting at the boathouse. I will not protect what was done to her any longer. Pike looked up sharply. Her. Miss Marple nodded. Evelyn Pennington did not die in 1940 from illness. The room tightened. She died because she was silenced. Victor opened his eyes, slowly. Miss Marple's voice became quieter. Arthur Gresham knew this. A pause, and he regretted what he had witnessed. Inspector Pike felt the pieces begin to lock together. That's why he was killed. Miss Marple inclined her head. Yes. She looked again at Ruth Pennington. And that is why Clara Morton went to the boathouse. A pause. Because Arthur Gresham confirmed everything she needed to know. Victor spoke suddenly. Who killed her? The question was sharp, emotional, not calculated. Miss Marple did not answer immediately. Instead, she stood slowly. She walked toward the fireplace, stopped beneath the portrait, looked up. "When Evelyn Pennington gave birth," she said quietly, "a decision was made." Her voice remained calm, not by servants, not by doctors, but by the person who controlled Blackwater House. She turned. Ruth Pennington finally met her gaze, and in that moment, everything became still. Miss Marple spoke gently. "You arranged it. No accusation, no anger, just fact." Ruth Pennington closed her eyes. For a long time she said nothing. Then, very softly, "I protected my family." Victor stared at her. "By destroying mine," her voice cracked. "I protected you." Silence again. He shook his head slowly. "You stole my life." Inspector Pike stepped forward. "Mrs. Pennington, Arthur Gresham." Her voice was barely audible. He recognized Clara. A pause. And he knew what she would do once she understood the truth. Miss Marple nodded slightly. He threatened to speak. Ruth Pennington did not deny it. Outside, somewhere beyond the window, the village continued its ordinary life. But inside the room, time seemed suspended. Miss Marple returned to her seat. She spoke gently. Clara Morton did not disappear by accident. A pause. She was lured. Victor's face tightened. Ruth Pennington did not look up. "At the boathouse," Miss Marple continued, "Clara confronted the truth." She looked at Ruth. "And you were there." A long silence. Then Ruth Pennington whispered, "She would have destroyed everything." Miss Marple nodded. "Yes." A pause. "That is what truth does." Inspector Pike's voice was low. "You killed her." Ruth Pennington finally spoke clearly. "It was never meant to happen like that." Her hands trembled. She wouldn't listen. Miss Marple remained very still. "So you silenced her?" A nod. "Yes." Silence again. Victor stepped back slowly, as though the room itself had shifted beneath him. "I don't know you," he said quietly. Ruth Pennington looked at him, for the first time, not as a secret, but as a loss. "I did it for you." He shook his head. "No." Miss Marple spoke softly. "And Arthur Gresham?" Ruth closed her eyes again. He saw her leave. A pause. And he knew. Inspector Pike exhaled slowly. The final piece had fallen into place. Miss Marple sat once more. Her expression remained calm, almost gentle. "It is always the same," she said quietly. "People think they are protecting love." A pause. "But what they are really protecting is themselves." No one spoke for a long time. Then Inspector Pike closed his notebook. Outside, the village of Brambleford remained unaware that its mystery had ended. Inside, the truth had finally surfaced, not with drama, not with spectacle, but with the quiet inevitability Miss Marple had always understood. Human nature, once observed closely enough, revealed everything. Later, as Ruth Pennington was taken away, Victor remained standing by the window. Miss Marple joined him briefly. He did not look at her. "Was any of it real?" he asked. Miss Marple answered softly, "Yes." A pause. "But not in the way you thought." The following morning, Room 7 at the White Heather Hotel was reopened. The key was removed from its hook. The luggage cleared. The silence inside the room no longer felt mysterious, only empty. Inspector Pike stood at the doorway for a moment longer than necessary, then turned away. Some cases, he reflected, did not end with triumph, only understanding. Miss Marple left Brambleford 2 days later. On the train, she watched the countryside pass by. She thought not of crime, but of people, of how easily they misunderstood themselves, and of how often love, fear, and pride could intertwine until even the most ordinary village held a secret capable of destroying lives. She adjusted her knitting. Then I looked out the window again. The case of Room 7 was finished, but as always, human nature remained unchanged, and that, she knew, would ensure there would always be another mystery somewhere waiting.